Hello and welcome to the Research Institute for European and American Studies. I'm Dan Little, Senior Advisor. On behalf of the Director of RIEAS, welcome to Post-COVID Wildcards in International Relations. Before going straight to the notion of wildcards, I want to let you know that wildcards mean different things to different people. So I wanted to provide a couple of examples to lead into my discussion. On the left-hand side, before the outbreak of coronavirus, there's attorney Steve Dickinson. Steve Dickinson represents a law firm that specializes in Chinese trade, and he has an article on the top 14 wildcards with relation to trade. So it's no exaggeration then that he covers a wide variety of potential wildcards. And of the 14, they tend to skip around between human rights, extraterritorial issues, trade practices, trade disputes, but I want to bring your attention to number 14. In that, whenever the Chinese central government gets cornered or in a defensive posture, they get defiant and no agreement will result. So this kind of leads into what happens after the coronavirus breaks out. Daniel Russell represents the Asia Society Policy Institute. He gives a lecture in February of 2020, and he talks about systemic failures that rupture public trust in China. So the issue here is that local officials aren't allowed to talk to outsiders about what's going on in their territories. And so whenever the leaders in Wuhan or Hubei feel cornered, they blame it on the central government. However, the central government, in turn, has to save face with the rest of the Chinese population. And when that happens, the officials in Wuhan and Hubei are expendable. Now, the average Chinese citizen has had occurrences where things didn't quite add up. And Russell points to the SARS epidemic of 2003, the Sichuan earthquake in 2008, the Guangzhou high-speed railway crash in 2012. But by and large, what's significant about Wuhan coronavirus is that the Chinese don't perceive this as a health issue, but a political one. And that is because 10 years ago, Hu Jintao in 2010 stated that China will double its GDP by 2020. So we are now in 2020. And it is no exaggeration then that the trade tariff dispute between the US and China was recently resolved. And the ink was barely dry on this agreement when COVID-19 or coronavirus broke out. So now that you looked at the first two, we're now going to transition to Gordon Chang, who a few weeks ago wrote a piece. And in this piece, there's a number of things being discussed, but I'll do my best to keep it central to the discussion. First, he believes that a lot of global leaders feel that America is now marginalized, and the fight against Wuhan coronavirus is no exception. Second, that the Chinese behavior toward other countries is more belligerent or bellicose in nature. Gordon Chang mentions the fact that when Wuhan started having issues with the coronavirus, that Italy donated medical equipment, but a few weeks later, Italy itself succumbs to the outbreak of coronavirus. And the Chinese central government sold back the very donated equipment provided by Italy in the first place. He further accuses the Chinese leader of knowing by as early as the second week in December that coronavirus was prevalent and that it was contagious, and yet pressured countries not to impose travel restrictions. Likewise, in February, China turns around a ship carrying the very medical gear that New York City needs. At the same time, they nationalize an American factory producing such medical equipment and restricts further exports. Now, a number of countries have taken steps to address this once and for all. Japan, for example, is trying to move its manufacturing base out of China and dependency on China. The US is preparing a package for corporations to be reimbursed for the money that they lost and to relocate its manufacturing operations in the United States. In Great Britain is reconsidering purchase of Huawei 5G And the reason is 5G provides faster internet, but Huawei 5G is believed to give the Chinese central government an ample opportunity to spy on citizens of other countries. So with that said, you have other provocations in international waters, in Hong Kong, and Gordon Chang also mentions Kazakhstan, but doesn't explain it in enough detail. So what's going on with Kazakhstan is you have Chinese investment, you have Chinese factories, you have Chinese citizens working in the factories, and if you look at the history between the Mongolian Empire and China, if by some chance their influence is such that they become de facto Chinese, this realizes a long-held ambition over centuries of where the Chinese claim back lands taken by the Mongols hundreds of years ago. Another thing is that President Trump at an April 18th press conference wondered aloud if the spread beyond China was deliberate. If you're an observer of this administration, you're going to find that such utterances are often analyzed, ridiculed, and bandied about in the media. But anytime that something like this is said, I can assure you that something will follow somewhere down the road where it gets revisited. And I think that's especially the case with President Trump's statement. So now we finally get to the discussion of wildcards, as far as my interpretation of them. And wildcards are nothing more than unintended consequences that affects actors, but also others around them. We have analogies such as ripples in the pond, or events running away from their creators. There's also an expression, be careful what you wish for, you might actually get it. But in more learned circles, there's talk of exogenous shocks, where certain events happen to people and it's beyond anybody's control. Also, symmetric powers, nation states act very similarly in nature, and things happen due to their own intractable behavior. Asymmetric powers, those that are not as powerful, have their own way of acting intractable, but they pursue their aims to better their position somewhat differently. But wildcards are not in itself of an explanation to what we need to know, because there's also a phenomena called black swans. And this was coined by economist Nassim Taleb, who argued that the course of history is driven by rare and extreme events. So there are wildcards and black swans. My hypothesis about wildcards is such that not all wildcards become black swans, but all black swans emanate from wildcards. And just to go over a few examples very quickly, as children in school, we learned about the start of World War I being the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914. Moving right, 40 million are killed during the First World War. 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is signed. Now, go all the way down, and you follow the dotted line to the right, the 1990s Balkans. Because of the Treaty of Versailles, and after the Second World War, and after Tito, some of this reemerges as a conflict. And this goes all the way back, if you follow the line down and to the left and back up to the 1878 Council of Berlin. The 1878 Council of Berlin and the 1919 Treaty of Versailles are very similar in that external powers dictated the boundary lines that divide nationality, ethnicity, and cultures. Now, for the purposes of argument, you may ask, well, was there a black swan before the Council of Berlin? That was the 1371 battle at Marica in Bulgaria, the first time the Ottoman conquest set foot in Europe. And according to Noel Malcolm, over the next couple of hundred years, they almost went as far as Vienna in the 1640s and also the 1720s. But the significance of the Council of Berlin is that the powers of the Ottoman Empire are significantly diminished. And by the time we get to 1919 and the Treaty of Versailles, there is no more Ottoman Empire. Another black swan. In 1923, E.H. Carr wrote about the Treaty of Versailles being onerous on Germany, and that at some point in time, Germany would rebound and engage in another world war as a result. And it became true. If you go to the right from the Treaty of Versailles, the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty involved the UK, US, France, Germany, Italy, Japan. So that by the time that you look at the 1930s, early 1930s, Hitler takes power, renounces Treaty of Versailles, and the other Axis powers, namely Italy and Japan, renounced the Washington Naval Treaty. But the Black Swan doesn't occur during the advent of the Second World War. So Poland is being invaded, Sudetenland, Austria. By that time, though, it is the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, that brings the U.S. into conflict not only in the Pacific side, but on the Atlantic side as well. It's there that the whole war shifts, and that in turn is a black swan. Now, there are other petitioners to the Treaty of Versailles, and Macmillan has this wonderful story of a 19-year-old dishwasher in Paris who tried to petition Woodrow Wilson based on his teachings of self-determination, but he's sent away. And going back to Vietnam, he wants to change the status quo of French colonialism in Vietnam. His name, Ho Chi Minh. And having nowhere else to go except to the communist influences surrounding Vietnam, he establishes an army of liberation, as you say. And in 1955, the US gives assistance to Vietnam. Now, at this point, the US has not directly engaged North Vietnam. And so in 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurs, and that's a black swan event because it brings in the Russian powers under the former Soviet Union and the Chinese powers under Mao Zedong, and they wage war in assistance to North Vietnam. The Vietnam War is prosecuted, and by 1972, Henry Kissinger and President Richard Nixon go to Beijing and engage in détente. And that started what we have today in terms of a strong Chinese central government, but economic activity that makes them a very wealthy country. So you could say that even today, the Wuhan coronavirus could very well be another black swan event. As we transition into the actual wild cards and potential black swans surrounding Wuhan coronavirus, I can't underscore enough how serious and how sobering what I'm about to tell you can be. And so I would say that if it is indeed from a laboratory, that in itself is legitimate research because laboratories do study pathogens in a laboratory environment. But if it was taken out of a laboratory, why and for what purpose? What was its intended use? Because once a pathogen is taken out of a laboratory, now you're carrying around a weapon. So there's only two options. One is if it's really meant to be used on people, was it used internally? The only way that you would know that is if you were able to visit the internment camps where the Uyghur Muslims are kept. This is where they're trying to be dissuaded from practicing their Muslim faith and adopt a more conciliatory tone to follow the central government in Beijing. You would have to visit them to see if they're actually being treated for Wuhan coronavirus. Because if they're not, there could be an accusation of genocide, but in turn it also frees up room along the western borders around Urumqi and Xinjiang. With that said, if its intended use was external to China, you would have to make an argument that the Chinese did so deliberately in their own country when they could have easily have taken it somewhere else to another country and released it there. And I think that the conspiracy theories would fall on shaky ground if the Chinese would do it in such a way where they make themselves an obvious scapegoat for things going horribly awry. Now, this does bring up another potential problem, in that a lot of the parties are signatories of the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, which is an extension of the Geneva Convention of 1922. But the US Congress in 1989 took this convention a step further, in that they passed the Bioweapons Anti-Terrorism Act. So whoever releases a biological weapon is not only a terrorist, but is also a criminal. Now, this is an entity that's separate and distinct, a separate branch of government from the executive branch under President Trump. Likewise, the judiciary branch is also equal and separate under the US Constitution. I doubt that governors of states will bring suits successfully against a national government, such as China. However, there is stare decisis or case law precedent for seizing assets in the United States. If you look at the Chinese holdings in US treasuries, such as bonds, notes, and other instruments, there's over $1 trillion that's currently being held, which means that the US government is spending $4 trillion to combat coronavirus, and there is $1 trillion owned by the Chinese that is sitting there. To compound it, there's a lot of Chinese state-owned companies with subsidiaries in the United States doing businesses with other companies. Of the 109 Chinese companies in the Fortune Global 500, only 15% are privately held. The rest are state-owned. Now, this also becomes dicey because the US court system does allow other countries with similar situations, similar subsidiaries, to join the United States as a plaintiff against Chinese assets held in the United States. You see, not only are the treasuries held by the Chinese up for grabs, but also the assets in the United States and also in the countries joining the suit. So, the politicians in Washington, and I'm talking about both parties, whether it's legal, illegal, or gray, they both have benefited from Chinese largesse for a number of years. However, if they're to maintain power, they have to overtly make overtones against the Chinese if they want to maintain power. And this becomes a very unique catch-22. I also foresee in the World Trade Organization, and especially the UN Security Council, the Chinese veto on certain actions, so that anything against Chinese interest will definitely be vetoed and will go no further. And it will deadlock international bodies. With that said, a lot of people don't realize that early this year, the US government has already been investing in coming up with an alternative to Huawei's 5G. They are paying Sweden's Ericsson and Finland's Nokia to come up with an alternative. And the reason is because not only will this be faster internet, but it respects the data rights of people in the United States, but also the European Union and the GDPR, protecting European data rights. So all of this is transpiring in the next 30 to 60 days. There is also a scenario where the opposition party in Canada will try to bring down the Trudeau government. There was a first scandal involving NSC-Lavalin with regards to the Trudeau administration, and this involved bribery of Libyan officials. Now, the opposition is well aware of a strange coincidence that took place in December. You see, a subsidiary of SNC-Lavalin, Candu Energy, received an award to partner with China National Nuclear Power in December of 2019. The following month, January 2020, the extradition hearing of Huawei Chief Financial Officer Meng Wanzhou starts in Vancouver. Meng Wanzhou is also the daughter of the CEO of Huawei. And the reason that the US government wants Meng Wanzhou to be extradited is because of violation of Iran sanctions. With that said, Hong Kong is a continuing problem. Taiwan, South China Sea, the Spratly Islands are an ongoing concern. Russia and Central Asia is increasing in friction. Russia is trying to return Chinese citizens infected with corona. The Chinese government will not take them back. And the Chinese-Russian border, divided by a river, there's an increase in cases on both sides of the river, and especially on the Russian side. Kazakhstan, I explained before. Kyrgyzstan is in a similar situation where Russian influence, factories, and Chinese workers have a tendency to potentially override the country. But also, in Kyrgyzstan, there is a transit of Chinese goods westward towards Central Asia, namely the Turkic-speaking countries and ultimately Europe. If the Dordoy Bazaar north of Bishkek goes down, Dordoy is the largest outdoor bazaar in the world. If this cuts off Chinese goods, and the ports are closed for Chinese goods to go elsewhere, that is also a potential black swan problem. North Korea is another potential black swan problem. Kim Jong-un was rumored to be dead. Now that he's back, who knows what happens next? The Belt and Road Initiative is where less fortunate countries, through influence, sign on to pay back loans that they can't really pay back, and through diplomacy, default, and graft, the natural resources that are prevalent in Africa now is solely beholden to China. Now, this does present a very interesting dilemma, and I wrote about the Russian oligarch Prigozhin and the Wagner Group in Russia. In that, with regards to mineral rights, there'll probably eventually be a clash between Belt and Road Initiative and the Russian oligarchs and African mineral rights. So opportunities abound for things to get at least interesting or much progressively worse as a black swan. But I think at this point, it is important to reiterate that we will all get through this. It won't always be bad. It will certainly be interesting. And as long as we stay safe and civil with one another, we will also get through this. And hopefully in some fashion, we'll emerge the same, if not better than ever before. And so with that said, if there's anything that RIEAS can do as far as fulfilling your research or investigative needs, our email and our website is posted. And on behalf of the director of RIEAS, again, thank you for your time. Stay safe.